This story is true, and it happened to me in April of 2017 in Caracas. My then girlfriend, now wife, and I had been staying at my mother-in-law's apartment for a few weeks. My mother's apartment, where we lived, was being renovated at the time. For some context, the apartment that we were staying in was located on the 4th floor of a relatively small 10-floor building. It was positioned right in front of the city's main highway. I say it was a small building because there are very tall buildings in my city. Some were as tall as 40 or 50 floors. The people that lived in these buildings suffered greatly when the elevators did not work. Imagine going up and down 50 or 60 floors. It's a lot of exercise for one day. There were a lot of things I had to get used to in that place. Chief among them was hearing the sounds of cars, trucks, bikes, flat tires, damaged exhaust pipes, and occasional gunshots, which came from the poor neighborhoods. They were close by to my girlfriend's home. They could be heard during day and night. In contrast, my mother's neighborhood was usually very quiet, especially at night. I had to change my sleeping habits a little bit, so I usually went to bed quite late, usually at midnight or 1 a.m. This apartment was smaller than my apartment, and it was located on a different side of the city. I did not care about those things, as long as I could get a good night's sleep next to my wife. I suffered from insomnia sometimes. The first time I came to my wife's apartment, I noticed there was a small hill with a huge tree. There were some medium-sized plants, bushes, and patches of grass. They were right next to the highway, and it seemed a little creepy to me at night. On the hill, I noticed there was a small makeshift aluminum shack. I thought that was a little funny, and I thought to myself that it was weird. Maybe some homeless person lives there. If he does, he must be crazy to be living there. On the first 2 nights that I stayed there, even though I could hear some loud sounds from the highway, it didn't take me long to fall asleep. Everything was okay, and I was able to get a good night's rest. But on the 3rd night, as much as I wanted it to be exactly the same, it was quite a bit different. I remember it was late at night. I think it was midnight or even later, and I was almost sound asleep. I was listening to some horror stories on my cell phone to fall asleep to. Just life as usual, however crazy as that sounds. Suddenly, I was startled by the ear-piercing screams of some man or woman. He or she was hurling long strings of F-bombs and other curses at somebody or something else. This woke me up right away and scared the hell out of me at the same time. I thought to myself, what or who was that? I shook my wife's shoulder and told her, "Hey honey, did you hear that?" She was still asleep, but responded, "Hear what? It was nothing. Just go back to sleep." However, I heard the curses again, so I decided to investigate what the heck was going on. I got up from bed, rubbed my eyes, put on my slippers, and walked slowly and quietly out of our bedroom towards the balcony. I could clearly see the highway and the small hill next to it. I could still hear the curses more clearly, and it sounded like the voice of a deranged man. I thought to myself, maybe I was right, and there was indeed some homeless person living in that metal hut. I was standing shirtless in my boxers and slippers on the dark balcony. I was looking to the hill, where I saw that metal hut on the first day in that apartment. Weirdly enough, I was able to see a small campfire and a barefoot man coming out of the shack who had long disheveled hair. He had a long bushy beard as well. He was shirtless and wearing some torn pants that were almost destroyed. He came out of the small shack, smoking a cigarette, or God only knows what drug he was on. He was standing on that hill in the dark, screaming his lungs out, and cursing a lot, for some reason, while looking towards the highway. I thought this man must be crazy. He must have been high or drunk to be yelling at passing cars. This made me feel terrified, as I asked myself, what is this guy saying? And isn't he cold? Because of this racket, there were some neighbors' dogs barking in the man's direction. I thought it was really strange for someone to be screaming so much, especially late at night. Unfortunately for me, my mother-in-law was a night owl and usually slept in the living room. She turned on the kitchen's light to get some water, and then went back to sleep. That reflected a little bit towards the balcony. I turned my head around, and was a little blinded by the glare of the light, but at the same time, I was scared that this man would see me staring at him. At that moment, I hid and crouched below the window, so the man could not see me. I was horrified when I saw this man walk back to the fire, and angrily put it out with his bare feet. He turned his head around from the highway to look at the outer wall of the building. All the while, he was still cursing out loud. I thought to myself, well, maybe he's having a bad trip or something. Suddenly, this crazy guy looked up at the building wall. He walked up until he was right in front of it, then he yelled, "I can't take it anymore, and the voices in my head are driving me crazy." He started to repeatedly bash his head against the wall until it was bleeding. He continued to yell, "Get out of my head." The sound it made was terrifying. When he was done, he touched his head with his hand and cleaned the blood off his chest. He looked even crazier than before. Out of the blue, the guy looked up and noticed that I was staring at him, so he yelled at me, "What are you looking at? Mind your own business, you idiot." I was scared to death, so I threw myself to the balcony's ceramic floor. I winced at how cold it was, and hid there for a while. I thought to myself, out of sight, out of mind, right? The crazy guy kept screaming his curses at me. I decided that was enough for me, and quietly crawled back to the bed. I felt horrified at what I saw, and could not sleep for the whole night. All I could hear were my mother-in-law's snores, and the guy's screams, until 2 a.m. The next day, I felt extremely tired, because I was not able to rest the night before. I told my wife about what happened, so she told me, yeah, at some point you get used to that crazy guy and his screams. But she didn't believe that the guy bashed his brains into that wall. So it dawned on me, what if I can hear that guy's screams again tonight? Should I call the cops on that guy? I decided not to, because my country's police are basically useless. So I still don't know what to do about that crazy guy screaming at me. His awful screams still give me nightmares, and I know I'll never look out that balcony window at night again. I was 13, and there was a home game in early fall. The game was a blowout, which resulted in me and my cousin leaving early to make the 1.5-hour walk back home. I lived across town, and my cousin lived next door to me. My dad didn't like me and my cousin walking home at night, out of fear that something might happen to us. The walk didn't bother me, it was relaxing. It was something I've always enjoyed. He called my cell and asked me if he was picking us up from the game. I lied and told him that I caught a ride with some friends. I said we were going to get something to eat, and then I'd be back home at 11 or 11:30. He said that was fine, and that he'd be waiting up for me. He said he'd leave the door open. We made it back to our little corner, which was separated to a V leading to our individual houses. We made our way down our driveways to our houses that were about 100 yards away. Halfway up my driveway, I felt something unfamiliar. It was an alert and nervous feeling, a feeling that someone would get when they were being watched. I quickly shrugged it off. When I got into the porch light, a cloud of calmness shadowed me, but it soon ended when I heard a shout from my cousin coming from the thick bush and trees. He shouted my name, and with that, followed the most eerie laugh I've ever heard. Thinking he was in trouble, I called out to him to see if he was okay. Dead silence was the only response. I decided to give him a call as soon as I made it inside my house. I made it to the door to find that it was locked. My dad's car was in the driveway, so I assumed that he was home. I knocked on the door and called his cell phone multiple times, but didn't receive any response. I called his girlfriend's cell phone, thinking she might have picked him up, but she wasn't answering me either. I decided to go next door to my cousin's house and wait for my dad to call. As I looked down my dark driveway, I had that nervous feeling creeping up again. I tried to keep my mind off of it, thinking of random things, but that soon was interrupted by a twig snap. There was a rustling in the bush, and then a whisper that sounded like my name. Without hesitation, I took off in a sprint the rest of the way towards my cousin's home. I made it to the door and entered without knocking. I was greeted by my cousin's grandmother. Frightened and concerned, she asked if everything was all right. I couldn't respond because I was running so fast. I caught my breath and told them what I heard. I then asked my cousin why he screamed after we left each other. They had a confused look on their faces, and his grandmother said that he didn't scream. She was smoking outside and watched him come up the road. I was confused and called my dad's cell a couple more times. I still didn't get an answer. It was then that my cousin offered to walk back with me to my place, see if we could get my dad to answer the door. I wasn't sure if he believed me and was concerned, or if he wanted to see if he could experience the same thing. We made it to the spot where I heard the noises and whispers, so we stopped to listen. All we heard were crickets singing. We made it back to my house and started knocking again. I called my dad's phone again, but still didn't get an answer. I decided to just sleep at my cousin's house for the night. I leaned against my brick wall house, and that's when I saw it. A silhouette of someone barely visible in the moonlight, perched in a tree. I was speechless and couldn't say anything. All I could do was shrug my cousin's shoulder and stare at the figure. My cousin fixed his eyes on me, paralyzed. The figure jumped out of the tree and over my house. He shouted at me to run. We ran our hardest towards his house. The whole time, we heard twigs and brush being snapped in the woods that surrounded both sides of the road. We finally made it to his yard, and the noises stopped. I turned around, and I could see the figure perched in another tree, just staring at me. My cousin yelled at me to come inside the house, but all I could do was stare at the thing. He then grabbed my arm and dragged me into the house, all while looking down to the ground to prevent him from looking at that thing that had stunned me. We told his grandmother what we experienced, and her being a Native American elder, she had heard similar stories. Being the son of a man who was raised from a cultural family, I heard the same stories from my dad and uncles. I didn't believe them until this night. As we grew tired, they set the couch up for me to sleep for the night. That evening, I had the scariest dream. It bothered me so much that I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. It was the same situation, but I walked towards the whisper of my name. Out of the bush, an elderly woman walked out. She looked like a normal elderly woman at first, then her face aged until it began to decay. She limped towards me, reached out, and grabbed me by the arm. Then I woke up to a phone call from my dad at 8 a.m. I answered. He was pissed and worried. I told him I was on my way home, and that I would explain when I got there. After getting grounded for walking home from the game, I got a chance to tell him what happened. I asked him if he had gone to bed early that night, and he told me that he stayed up until 1 in the morning, waiting for me. I showed him my call history. He didn't believe me, and then checked his phone. After seeing that I did attempt to call him, he had this confused look on his face. He then called next door to see if I was telling the truth. My cousin's grandma told him everything that had happened. He told me that he was watching TV and unlocked the door before falling asleep. He also said that he didn't hear me knocking at 11:30, which was the time I made it back home. He didn't question me anymore about that night. My dad passed away a year later. My cousin and his grandma moved some years back. I look up in the trees sometimes to see if I can spot that thing that frightened me when I was a kid. I'm 26 now, and I still live in the same house. I haven't seen or heard anything since that night. The street I used to live on was on the midway point between two dimensions. You had the mixed poor to middle-class street. It was full of hard-working laborers who fought for their homes and took great pride in them on one side. On the other side, you had the low-class poor townhouses, which were $250 a month to rent. You can't obtain these townhouses without being on some kind of social assistance. The two areas were separated by trees, one in our neighbor's yard and one across the street. It's odd to say, but these two areas rarely collide. It was back in 2013. The night was vicious as always, and nippy. The temperature was hovering around minus 40 Celsius, and the roads were ice rinks. This took place back when my dad and I weren't the healthy fitness freaks we are today. We were watching Moonrise Kingdom when our bi-nightly Tim's craving hit, and we ran out for a couple of donuts, a couple of ice caps, and a couple of Timbits. I know, bad food. When we returned home, I noticed a vehicle quickly moving behind us. As I got out of our vehicle, I looked back to see a red Cavalier speeding to a stop at one of the townhouses. A man who I think was Aboriginal and was hog-tied, hands and feet together, came flying out onto the thick ice in front of his yard. My dad was a slow-moving man. In a lot of ways he still is. He doesn't acknowledge crime exists. He built a thick bubble around his mind to keep him from thinking about it. I'm sure he knew it happened. He spent 35 years here, and his job was writing press releases and propaganda for a local reserve. It's hard to believe he didn't know what happened. After I saw them toss the guy out, I dashed up the stairs, colliding with my dad. I quickly whispered, "Let's get in the house, come on." "Give me a second," my dad screamed at me, nervously looking across the street. Two guys got out of that car and started kicking that man in the stomach and screaming stuff like, "You loser," and "Not so tough now." My dad was still fumbling with the keys. The right key was a different color, so I don't know why he couldn't find it. I grabbed the keys and jammed the right one in, pushing the door open in one fluent motion. Then I closed and locked both locks. "Impatient much?" my dad shouted and angrily grabbed his keys back. "Dad, there's someone across the street being mugged. I didn't want to end up a witness or a target," I said. My dad stopped untying his shoes and walked over to the window, then stared at them. I flipped out a little and said, "Well, don't gawk at them. They'll see you." As I walked to the window, the man in the driver's seat got out and looked around. The other two had their tirade, one kicking and one punching. This third guy came out and gave him a few good ones to the face, busting open his cheeks and nose. I quickly closed the blinds and went on with my life. The next day, there was a ton of frozen blood where they were, and a woman was loading the tenant's stuff into a moving van. That's all I know about what went down there.